All right. Well, I've got right at 1 o'clock Central Time. So either good morning or good afternoon, depending on what time zone you are in. I am Roseanne Scamahorn. I'm the Associate Director of the Southern Rural Development Center, and we have the distinct honor of being able to support and present to y'all this webinar series, Who Will Fill My Shoes? Succession Planning for Landowners and Businesses. Today we are going to be covering Module 1, which is going to be on communication and conflict in succession. So to give you a little bit of our disclaimer here, this material is based upon the support by the National Institute of Food and Agriculture and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So any opinions of findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in today's presentation and future presentations are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the view of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So again, welcome to everybody for attending today. This session is being recorded. After today's session, I will reach out to you with an email link that will have all of these materials provided for you. And as soon as the recording is available, that will be uploaded onto the website as well. We ask that as you participate today, that if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. And then at the end of today's session, we'll go through and review those questions for y'all. So at this time, I'm going to hand it over to Kurt to go ahead and get us started on today's webinar.
All right. Well, I hope everybody can hear me. Glad to be with you all today and happy to be a part of presenting the first module of 5 in succession planning. Today, sort of undertaking communication and conflict in doing succession planning. So we'll walk through this today, differentiate a little bit between estate planning and succession planning, and talk about conflict and give you some definitions, some worksheets and the like. But I did want to give credit to all the partnering organizations that put this together. I guess this is kind of the housekeeping part of doing webinars, but a lot of people, a lot of chefs were in the kitchen, so to speak. So thank you to North Central Regional Center for Rural Development, and of course, NC State University, where I'm a professor, Southern Rural Development Center, the Institute for Family Business, Mississippi State University's Department of Agricultural Economics, and last but not least, Purdue University. So succession planning, just sort of a broad stroke, encompasses a lot of things. This entire curriculum will be kind of a research-based curriculum. There'll be a lot of handouts that you can take with you, that you can download. So this is something you, hopefully a toolbox that you'll be able to carry forward with you, giving you strategies to move yourself, or I think a lot of people listening to the webinar today are kind of train the trainers. We'll give you a toolbox to kind of move your clients or your citizens forward with working towards succession planning. Today we'll cover probably a little bit more soft skills than hard skills, but throughout the 5 modules, if you're looking to get more into sort of legal and LLC kinds of things, hang in there. But today we're going to talk possibly one of the most foundational or most important things is dealing with conflict and communicating. So that's what we're going to work with today. The primary authors are here, and I guess this is a way to introduce. It's good to know who you're talking to, I suppose. So I'm in the middle there, Dr. Kurt Smith. I'm probably the least brilliant of the 3 here. So they put together a great 5-module series. I'm an assistant professor of forestry and environmental resources at North Carolina State University. So I teach forestry science as well as a graduate course in woodland stewardship. And I do a lot of outreach with underserved landowners, particularly in heirs property, but also in succession planning, niche markets, anything I can do to make underserved landowners more profitable. So with that, I'm going to ask if Renee and Becky, if you guys would introduce yourselves.
Thanks, Kurt. My name is Renee Wyatt. I'm a split position at Purdue University. I'm research and extension for the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development, and then I'm the family business management specialist for the Purdue Institute for Family Business. A lot of my research and extension programming is around succession planning. Purdue is blessed to have a succession planning team, which I'm part of. We go out around the state and do workshops. We do farm visits to work with farm and family businesses on their succession plan. So we've had a lot of trial and error there. So a lot of that comes in today too, or through all the 5 modules, really, those experiences. But I'm excited to be here with everybody, and I'll hand it over to Becky.
All right, good morning. Becky Smith, Mississippi State University Extension, housed in the Department of Agricultural Economics. I serve as the state specialist for economic education, as well as the family resource management state specialist. So I work in helping people close the gap, shorten the gap between intentions and behaviors.
Great. Well, thank you. And you'll be hearing from everybody through the 5 modules, some more than others. But it's a great team. It's been a lot of fun to put this together with everybody. So important notes before we begin. For those of you that are out there in extension world, hey, you've seen this slide before, I bet. So we're not out giving legal advice. We don't want anybody to take what we say as anything but education. So we're sort of the North Star, if you will. We're not trying to provide legal advice in what we're doing. Those kinds of things need to be obtained from an attorney or other professional. So we're sort of helping people come up with a critical thinking map. We're trying to help people make them very smart when they go to actually see a professional. So we're strictly educational here, and that's our disclaimer. So with that, typically, if we're running a workshop, so I'm kind of speaking to 2 audiences here, I suppose. A lot of people are here to learn how to train the trainer and how to do this very training for others. Some of you are probably actually landowners hoping to pick up things. So I think all of this will be germane and helpful for you. But generally, here's a few tidbits, if you will, small points of information that will help you be a good presenter. One is, and I kind of chuckle at this one a little bit. It says no personal stories. So if you're from North Carolina and you work with underserved landowner audiences, it's almost a certainty you're going to get these. So maybe the slide should say try to limit or control personal stories, but they can absolutely distract and derail a talk. So you want to sort of be conscious of that, even sort of admonish the crowd to kind of take those things outside of the group or during break, that kind of thing. But also be very welcoming of clarifying and general questions. You don't want to press on in the presentation if you haven't expressed something in the question or what you're presenting in a clear way. So you want people to feel welcome to do that. And then, of course, personal questions. You certainly want to kind of, in a pleasant way, sort of steer those outside of the group setting. So a little bit, warm up and introductions. We talked a little bit about this. I think this is the only time we'll cover this in the 5 modules, but we talked about the need. It's a good thing to do an icebreaker. So we won't obviously do one on the webinar, but just wanted to put out a word there about the value of doing an icebreaker. And I just included this as an example. A lot of you are extension folks, so you probably got about 1,000 of these in your back pocket. But this is one I do with my classes at NC State, and it's been great. It's actually been sort of the foundation before I even teach the class. I make every student take about 5 minutes, just write down your favorite food, the most interesting place you've ever visited, and maybe one interesting fact about yourself that nobody would know. And it's pretty remarkable. In a class of 50, I invariably have an Olympic gymnast or a magician or just some wild thing that you'd never dream of. But what happens when people go and stand up, and sometimes this will take 45 minutes, 30 minutes, let it go, because it kind of sets the stage for comfort. People need to be able to be comfortable with each other, have conversations outside of the webinar during break. and also to feel comfortable with each other to sort of test out ideas and assumptions with the entire crowd. So it has a lot of value for that. And if this is done well, this honestly can make the entire experience of a webinar or a workshop so much better. I mean, I really can't stress the importance of it. So I burn, like I said, 30, 45 minutes of a semester just doing this. And the dividends it pays are significant. So I encourage you to find one that fits you, fits your audience, and maybe apply that when you try to replicate something like this in a workshop setting. So with that, pressing on, just a few definitions. And this is something we sort of batted around a little bit. So really, it's become interchangeable. If you've been around very many people, succession planning, estate planning, they kind of slide and morph into each other. People say and mean the same thing sometimes. So we thought it good to just sort of define what it is we're talking about. And when we talk about succession planning, we're really talking about transfer of things during the life of the owner, be it your business, the ownership of your assets, of your farm, forest, agricultural land, whatever it is, it's the transfer of this management during the life of the owner himself. Estate planning is more the plan for transfer of personal assets and property after you're gone to those designated beneficiaries. And it's kind of interesting. If you went back 50 or 100 years ago, you probably would never hear the term succession planning. Typically, people would just work until they couldn't work anymore, and then they would pass it off. So you just had estate planning. But now people are retiring at 60, 65, 70, and they have 20, 30 years of productive life left. And so there's a real need for this succession planning to sort of prepare not just for management, but also to sort of prepare things to go well for estate planning as well. So when we use those two terms, just sort of keep that in mind. We're differentiating. Another term or two terms you'll hear throughout the 5 modules are successor and incumbent. So successor, we're talking about that junior generation in your land or business that will continue to manage or own the land and business after you're gone. The incumbent, that'll be the senior generation, the land, business, the current owner, et cetera, et cetera. So 2 more terms for you to be aware of. Also, when we talk about businesses, we're talking about entities like farms, LLCs, proprietorships, trusts, et cetera. Partnerships, when we're talking about land or use that term, we're talking about everything. We're talking about your forest, your farmland, vacant land, all your assets, land and building, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to talk a little bit about communication and conflict in session 1 and sort of look at some of these questions. And I think it's a great topic. I didn't mention at the top, but I thought to mention that a recent Harris poll showed that 90% of people plan to pass on their equity and their resources to their heirs. And yet 40% of these folks have no plan at all to do it, which sort of creates an incredible amount of conflict. And probably the hardest part of that, I think, is having worked with a lot of landowners, done a lot of stakeholder groups, is families that absolutely love each other, are fully functioning for generations, can fall apart over succession planning or the lack thereof when you start getting into dividing up land and assets, money, et cetera, brings out so much emotion. So dealing with this early on and often and directly, which is what we're going to teach in the next 5 modules, can pay huge dividends and help put people's mind at complete rest or peace. So with that, moving into, I think, Renee's topic, she's going to start covering why are we fighting? Why do people have conflict over these assets, over this land?
Perfect. Thank you, Kurt. So when we think about conflict and succession, I like to start by kind of brainstorming why there's so much conflict and succession. So if you're presenting this to an audience, you might want to do the PowerPoint graphics where you like zoom these in one at a time so you can talk about them. But when I'm presenting this, I like people to go around the room and kind of tell me why they think there's so much conflict in succession. But really, it can be a lot of different reasons. It depends on if we're talking about land, are we talking about a business, are we talking about a farm, we're talking about grain bins. It can be all of these things. But one of the big ones is family legacy, right? When I think about legacy, I think about, those farmers or those landowners have been there for generations. They're passing on not only a piece of property or a business, but this legacy. It's been their whole life. It's been what they've worked and sacrificed for. And so there's a lot of feelings that people have with that. And I know from talking to farmers, if you say anything about, oh, I'm going to host a conflict and communication session, nobody will come. But if you phrase it something like, strategic positioning to maintain your business through the next generation, then people will come. So make sure you think about that when you're marketing. But in farms and with land, land has gone up in value. It is a lot of assets that are tied up in that. So that can cause a lot of conflict. We say more money, more problems, right? So that there's a lot of problems tied up in that. When we mix the business and the family, that can cause some tugs and concerns. Do we put the family first? Do we put the business first? If there's a sporting event and we need to harvest, if we're a farmer, which ones comes first? That can cause a lot of conflict, but it can also cause conflict when we're passing down that business, right? The heir who has been working in the business, working on the land, they might get more. That can be hard to explain to the other siblings, right? So this mixing of business and family can cause a lot of conflict. Next, communicating across generations. Every generation kind of communicates in different ways. There's different ways we receive and send communication. That can cause some issues as well. Sometimes different people in the land or family or business, they have different values. They have different conflict styles. So we're going to talk about conflict styles today. Sometimes we have misaligned goals. Very common in succession is lack of communication. The senior generation kind of has a plan in their mind. They don't always feel comfortable sharing it with the next generation. They don't want to make people angry. They want to make sure they still have Christmas together. So they don't want to talk about succession, and that can cause a lot of conflict. Emotions can really run high. Some people have very strong ties to a certain parcel or a certain part of the business or a certain part of the farm. That can cause conflict. And there's not always a fair and equal, equitable way to transfer the property or business to the next generation. Sometimes there's just not. You've probably heard fair versus equal. That can come into play, and it's a lot up to the incumbent on how they want to define that. And lastly, ambiguity in the succession plan. That can cause a lot of resentment. It can cause a lot of conflict. What does the timeline look like? When does the next generation actually get to manage something, right? They've been working on the business. They've been helping with the land. When do they actually get to manage something? Ambiguity in who will control what. What will I receive in the succession process, right? What does that all look like at the end? All of these things can lead to conflict in the succession process. So something we like to do with families to start out is use this FB-Bragg functioning assessment. If you've heard of the APGAR, it's kind of the family business take on the APGAR. It's 4 questions. What we like to do is have every member of the family fill it out and rank, how often are you satisfied with those 4 questions. You rank those, you add up your score. Scores range from dysfunctional to highly functional. When we did this with a bunch of family and farm businesses, most of them were dysfunctional or moderately dysfunctional. So we like people to know that going in. So if you are moderately dysfunctional or dysfunctional, it's okay. But it's interesting to see what everybody scores around the table and kind of compare those. That can kind of break down some of those communication barriers and start to get conversations flowing. So if you have any questions about that, let me know. But that's a fun assessment to do with people and kind of eye-opening. So we collected some survey data from farmers in the north central region of the US in 2023. And we said, okay, for this group, they inherited the business from a family member. We asked them, how successful did you perceive that transfer? So these are the people who actually ended up with the business, right? So 20% said unsuccessful, 78% said successful, and I know it adds up to 101, it's rounding. Neither successful nor unsuccessful is about 3%. So there's a fifth of those people who got control of the business, but they said it was unsuccessful. And so we asked them, if you said unsuccessful, why is that? And they said it was because the process itself, the succession process itself was not what they expected. It goes back to that ambiguity that we talked about. It's a huge form of conflict. And then for those that felt successful in the transfer, they said they felt certain and secure on the timeline and who was to be included. So outlining these things and having these things communicated to everybody is so important in the succession process. So this goes back to the FB brag, but really when we're thinking about functional families, functional businesses, it's really fostering that culture where the people in the family and business can turn to each other for help when something's troubling them. They feel that others accept and support their ideas. They're satisfied in the way that others in their family and business share time together. So that family versus business pull that I talked about. And they're satisfied with the outcome when a decision has to be made in favor of what is best for the family versus the business or other commitments. So these are the four main topics really that foster that culture that creates highly functional and highly effective families and businesses. So next we're going to talk about the incumbent and successor and their commitment to the succession process. So we defined this a little bit before, but just to remind you, the incumbent is that senior generation. We have a sandwich generation, which is kind of that generation that's stuck in between. And then we have the successors, which are the junior generation. So when we think about succession, it's really about adapting roles and having a self-understanding about how those roles change throughout time. When we think about farms and family businesses, the incumbent has to be the one really that starts that transition process. They're the ones that own the property, they manage it currently, they have all the power. They're the ones that have to say, okay, it's time. We need to start thinking about this transition. There's a need for that next generation to come in. Maybe that incumbent says, okay, we're missing something. We need the talents of that next generation. But we really, really encourage in a family and in a farm and in a business with land that it really is the incumbent is the one that needs to initiate that transition process. I know just from working with farmers, it's hard for them to communicate. And so a lot of times we're stalled out in that process. They get stuck. They don't feel comfortable bringing it up. They want to avoid conflict. They want to avoid those hard conversations. And so they just don't talk about it. But really the incumbent is the one that needs to initiate that transition process. When we think about goals of the incumbent and the successor, incumbents really often seek a fit between their own personal values and the characteristics of the successor. So they're wanting somebody like them, right? When they're choosing that next successor, they want somebody like them. If I think about people that I hang out with after work, it's people like me, right? We want to hang out with people like us who are like-minded. We have the same values. So it makes sense that they do that. But incumbent and successor, they're really mutually dependent. They really need to make sure that they acknowledge each other's goals and concerns and that every generation is heard. A lot of times, whoever has the gold makes the rules. We've heard that before. So the incumbent really, they have all of these assets. They have all of this power. But really, ideally, if we have a successful succession process, they're bringing in that successor and saying, okay, this is what I'm thinking. This is where I want to see the business or the farm or the land go. What are you thinking? Let me hear what your goals are and try to find a match between both sides. I think sometimes successors and incumbents are afraid to have that conversation. I know in farms, the incumbent generation, sometimes they say, well, what if they come in and change something? What if they do something different than what we did? What if they mess it up, right? What if they lose everything? So it's hard sometimes to talk through those goals and those fears, but really having those conversations and coming to an understanding can help both parties feel at ease with the process and how it's going to go. So I found this quote and I thought it was really applicable to this. So it's from Gaio and Amont from 2003, but it says the continuity of a family business depends on the capacity of the family who owns the company to reach unity and commitment between its members. It really spoke to me. It really does come down to that commitment and unity of all the parties involved to make the succession process a success. So when we think about what makes a family or a business successful, it's really about these shared values that are communicated and discussed. It's about shared power between all of the different entities. We have to think about tradition. You know, why are we here? What got us here? What are the sacrifices that led to this land still being in the family, or this farm still being in the family, or this business still working out? You know, what are the traditions that are there? A willingness to learn and grow from the incumbent and the successor. Um, Strong family ties can really help us get through, and then also commitment. So everybody involved in the succession process really has to have a commitment to the land, business, entity that we're talking about, as well as commitment to the family. So there's different types of commitment that we run into when we're thinking about that next generation joining the business. So there's calculative commitment. So in this scenario, the choice to join the business will really benefit or pay off for that successor. So in that scenario, they feel like they ought to join the business. They feel like they ought to benefit themselves. There's effective commitment, so the desire to pursue the business as a career. So these individuals, they really want to join that business. They're like, yes, I've seen this business. I know how it works. I want to join it. And then we have normative commitment. So the successor feels an obligation to join the business. So they need to, right? The family farm has been in the family for 100 years. You know, we have one of those heritage plaques, those 100-year stakes on our farm that says we've been in business for, 100 years on the same land. They feel like they need to join the business to keep that going. So there's different types of commitment, and we need to keep that in mind when we're thinking about succession. Next, we're going to talk about some conflict modes and how to implement them in everyday life and then in succession as well. So I was trained back in 2017 on the TKI, which is the Thomas Kilmann instrument. And it's a really great way that we can use to measure conflict and try to see how we use different conflict modes in different scenarios. But first of all, conflict really defined as any situation when your concerns or desires differ from those of another person. And in family, in business, in land ownership, and in succession, we're surely going to have some conflict at some point. But really, ultimately, what we want to get to is a resolution. So resolution is really an outcome. It's not like a specific process. Like if we do A, B, and C, then we'll get to resolution. No, that's not it. It's really that outcome at the end where all parties feel, okay, we've spoken our piece, we've come to agreement or come to at least a scenario where we can move forward, and the conflict can really be put to rest. It returns all the parties in the conflict back to productivity and coordination, and it allows everybody to address their relationship and resume coordination. So when we think about using these different conflict modes that we're going to look at, we like to start out by just thinking about what determines these different conflict modes. So there's two basic aspects that we're going to talk about, and that's assertiveness and cooperativeness. And really your conflict mode that you choose to utilize really depends on the skill. So as I'm going to teach you, you can all use all of the conflict modes depending on where you are. And it is a learned exercise, but also the situation. So what kind of situation are you in will help determine what kind of conflict mode you're going to want to use. So the five modes that we're going to talk about are avoiding, accommodating, compromising, competing, and collaborating. So first, we are going to talk about competing. So if we think about competing, it is very, very high on assertiveness. It's not very cooperative. When you think about somebody who's competing, they might be like, okay, might makes right, right? Whoever has the power is going to make the decision. But there are some ways that we can implement competitive conflict mode into our day-to-day life when we need to. Sometimes we might need to use this if we have to take a quick action. maybe making an unpopular decision. If there's something that's really near and dear to your heart and you have to stand up for it, that would be a good time to use it. And protecting yourself. So if you're at risk, you might need to compete. We don't think about competing in that situation, but you might need to compete if a quick or decisive action is vital. So in an emergency situation, you have an accident on the farm. Somebody is going to use their competitive mode and they're going to go in and make that quick decision. Everybody might be kind of yelling, what's going on. You can use your competitive conflict mode and say, okay, this is what we're going to do. You need to call 911. You need to do this. This is what we're going to do. That is actually a way that you can use that competing style. So there could be important issues in your farm or family business or on your land. Maybe an unpopular course of action needs implementing. Maybe you have to cut costs somewhere. Nobody likes that. Enforcing unpopular rules or even disciplining. If you're a manager of a business, you might need to use that. Also, if there's issues vital to your company welfare and you know that you're right. Or protecting yourself from people who take advantage if you're a non-competitive behavior person. So if your default mode is not to compete, people might catch on to that and try to take advantage. So you might need to compete sometimes to stand up for yourself. When we're thinking about competing in succession, there's a few times when you want to use this, maybe to stand up for non-negotiables. So for each generation in the succession plan, if they say, okay, we're going to start implementing the succession plan in 20 years. If you're the incumbent, you might say, no, that's a non-negotiable for me. We need to start that sooner. That would be a time to stand up for yourself and use the competing style. It could be to be sure that your voice is heard in the planning process. Maybe you have multiple incumbents, multiple of those senior generation people who are making decisions for the land or the farm. And you can stand up and say, hey, this sandwich generation and the successor generation, we want to make sure that our voices are heard as well. You can use that competing style. Next, we're going to talk about collaborating. Collaborating is high on assertiveness and cooperativeness. So if we're collaborating, we might say 2 heads are better than 1. This mode is really about integrating those solutions. It's about learning, gaining perspective, merging perspective, gaining commitment, and improving relationships. So you might want to use the collaborating style if you're looking to find an integrative solution. Also, when the concerns of both parties are too important to be compromised, maybe you're wanting to merge insights from multiple perspectives. And also when you need to work through hard feelings that have been affecting a relationship. So probably not surprisingly, in succession, we want to use this style a lot. Succession really has, you have to be integrated in your decision making if you're going to make that succession process successful. So the collaborating style in succession is really, really priceless. And we really want to make sure that we maintain both the family relationships and also maintain that farm or forest or property in the family. So we want to make sure we're collaborating and using this style in succession quite a bit. Next, we're going to look at compromising. So this is about medium on assertiveness and medium on cooperativeness as well. So for compromising, we might say, okay, we'll split the difference. So personally for me, when I took the TKI assessment that you can take, I was pretty high on compromising and pretty high on avoiding. So not surprisingly, knowing myself, I'm a people pleaser. I don't want to make conflict. So I was definitely not competing, sometimes collaborating, not a ton, definitely not competing though. But compromising, we can use this when resolving issues of moderate importance. So we want to compromise. We want to just kind of push through. It's kind of important, not life-changing. So we're going to compromise. If you have people with equal power and strong commitment and you want to reach a resolution, you might have to compromise. So that could be something you could use. Sometimes we compromise to create temporary solutions, or maybe we're dealing with time constraints. We're like, okay, we're not going to figure all of this out. Let's do something in between and move on. And then it can also be a backup to competing or collaborating. If you need to back off on the assertiveness a little bit, you can use this to kind of split the difference. So, like I said before, when we're trying to like achieve a temporary settlement of a complex issue, maybe you need a fast solution and to back up when collaboration or competition fails. That's really when we want to use the compromising style. In succession, we want to make sure we're not using compromising too much. We want to use it very sparsely. The issues in succession are really, really important to both parties almost all the time. If we have too much compromising, we're going to lead to resentment. If decisions have been made and too much compromise is from any generation, they're going to hold on to that and they're going to continue to see it. So we really want to avoid overusing compromising. Next, we're going to talk about avoiding. So avoiding is low on assertiveness and cooperativeness. So we might say leave well enough alone. So we're really if we're going to use avoiding, it couldn't be on unimportant issues. If you really don't care, you can just avoid it. Sometimes if you're trying to reduce tension, you might avoid a certain talk that you need to have later. I know we've probably all done this in family relationships. We're like, you know what? We've talked about this. We've gotten somewhere on this. Let's leave this other issue for later. Let's just avoid it. Sometimes you want to avoid something to buy time. Sometimes you avoid things because you know your limits. You're like, I can't take anymore. I'm going to just, yeah, avoid that issue altogether. Sometimes we avoid decision making because we're trying to allow others ownership on something. If there's a conflict going on, and you're like, yeah, that's not me. I don't want to be part of that. You leave somebody else to kind of fight that fight if you're not wanting to be in it for whatever reason. And then also if you're recognizing issues as symptoms, you can avoid things. I know I use this with my kids. When it gets close to bedtime or past bedtime and they're just cranky and full of attitude, I kind of avoid it because I know they're tired. I know they're not being like that just because they're like that, right? So we can recognize that that is actually a symptom and not an issue. So we want to use that avoiding conflict style when an issue is unimportant. Maybe you don't see a chance of satisfying your own concerns or winning an argument, so you can avoid it. When the potential costs of confronting a conflict outweigh the benefits of its resolution, you can avoid. Sometimes you need to let people cool down, so you avoid an issue for now. Maybe you don't have complete information on an issue or a conflict and you have to gather some more information versus making an immediate decision. Sometimes other people are more effective at resolving that issue than you, and so you can avoid it. And like I said, when an issue seems symptomatic of another more basic issue, you can avoid that conflict. So probably not surprising. We probably don't want to use avoiding very much in succession. Succession is really too important to avoid issues. If you avoid issues that are important to both parties, once again, you'll have resentment if decisions have been made and and there's too much that really just isn't discussed. If there's just decisions made, you've avoided conflict, that's probably not where we want to be. I know farmers are really avoiders. They don't want to talk about issues, but really it's too important to not talk about these issues in succession. And then lastly, our last mode that we're going to talk about today is accommodating. That's where, it would be my pleasure. So it's very cooperative. It's not very assertive at all. You can use accommodating if you're trying to show reasonableness or create goodwill. Sometimes if somebody is really, really mad, you can just keep the peace and use the accommodating style to make sure that everybody stays safe. If you're retreating, you can use the accommodating style. And maybe sometimes to maintain perspective, you can utilize this style. So when can we use the accommodating style in general? If you realize that you're wrong, if you're in the middle of an argument and all of a sudden you're like, you know what? Yeah, I'm dead wrong about this. You can use the accommodating style. Say, it would be my pleasure. Yes, we can do what you're saying. Let's accommodate that issue. If the issue is a lot more important to the other person than it is to you. So I know in my marriage sometimes there's things related maybe what we're going to plant on the farm that year or what inputs. I really don't care. So if we're discussing it, I let my husband choose. He can make it's much more important to him, I promise, than me. So I'm going to let him have that one. Sometimes you can use the accommodating style to build up social credits for later on issues that are more important to you. So there's that creating that goodwill. If you're outmatched in a conflict and you're losing, and more competition would only damage your cause, you can use the accommodating style and kind of let the other person win that one. When you're trying to preserve harmony and avoid disruptions that are especially important to you, you can use the accommodating style. And maybe if you want to help your employees by allowing them to learn from their own mistakes, you can let that employee on something do what they want to do and kind of reap the consequences or see what happens when they pursue what they want to do. So in succession, we can use the accommodating style some. If there's a topic in succession that's unimportant to you, if we're talking personally about grandma and grandpa's table, and you really don't care who gets that table, you can accommodate and let someone else have that, right? We can think about things like that. But really, we want to avoid accommodating when issues are important to both parties. Once again, we don't want that resentment to happen. We don't want there to be long-term damage to those relationships. So we don't want to accommodate too much. So basically, if you've learned anything from talking about these in succession, we want to make sure that we are at least somewhat assertive and at least somewhat collaborative. So we want to make sure that we're getting our own needs met, our voice is being heard. We don't want to cause undue conflict, but we want to make sure that the things that are important to us and to others, we have time to discuss those. So like I said before, each of us can use all of these 5 conflict handling modes. Each has its own place depending on the situation. If you take the TKI or maybe just clicking through these, you can kind of say, oh, okay, yeah, that's my default conflict mode. We each have a default conflict mode or a couple of default conflict modes that we normally use, but each has its own place in your family and in your business. And it's really, it's like a muscle. The more you use those different conflict modes, the more you'll get used to using them and the more you'll be able to implement them when the situation is a right fit for that conflict mode. You just really want to think about when you're using them and why, and not just always going to your default mode. And you can also have different default modes in your business and your family. So maybe in your business, you're really competitive. You like to be assertive, you like to win. And maybe in your family, you're a little bit more laid back, right? You're more, okay, I'm just here to serve the family. I'm not going to compete at home. We can see those different conflict modes come into place depending on where you are in the situation. And it can also depend on who you're dealing with. If you're dealing with someone else who is highly competitive, you're probably going to have to be competitive to get your voice heard. And in succession, we see that a lot. The incumbent generation, since they hold the cards and hold the power, sometimes the incumbents don't feel empowered to make those decisions and be competitive for their own values and for what they want. But really, we need to come to some kind of agreement and understand how we can use the conflict mode to move forward in the succession process. I think next it is Kurt's.
Yep, I'm sorry. I've got it. So, yeah, that's great. Thanks, Renee. Those are great strategies. If you're like me, it was like a highlights reel going through my head of family meetings and family conversations, as well as work and colleague conversations, and how those different strategies come into play. But we wanted to give some examples. And of course, when I say examples, by way of general comment, any of these things in the module, if you can inculcate or incorporate examples into any of these, that even small examples that lead to discussion in small groups or general discussions, I think those are great learning tools. So just showing you one example here that you might use or change up or adapt, but a general encouragement to use as many examples for discussion as you can possibly come up with when you're doing a kind of a general workshop. So here's a conflict scenario. Probably not an unusual one, I would say, at least in the forestry or agricultural land business. In this scenario, Trish is part of a family hog operation, and none of the other siblings are interested in the business. She's been working the business for 15 years. Her parents just assume for 15 years, when we pass on, Trish will take the business over. Well, come to find out, Trish has a passion for teaching, or she is a whiz bang at some microelectronics and has a job offer to go to California. And there you are. So you have this parents that have the one sibling they were banking their family legacy on is moving to California. You know, what then? And this may have been something in Trish's head for 15 years or 10 years. So what went wrong? You know, what was the problem here? And I have to say, you know, I'd make an example that's good for your locale, but this is not an unusual example. When it comes to forest and agricultural lands, folks, families, very frequently around here, at least in North Carolina, with the high tech moving in, very few of the kids want any part of the family farm or forest. Frequently it skips a generation. The grandkids are a lot more excited about it. So what's the secret? I mean, what did they do wrong here? And I think probably everybody's rolling their eyes and saying, well, of course, I know what the problem was. They didn't communicate, right? That's how it all could have been avoided. So communication, doing proper communication. And I guess what I mean by that is it just can't, it's a little bit like even teaching in a class. You know, I can't come down to the final exam and just lay a grade on it with no explanation or no steps that went into that. There's an expectation there that you communicate daily. Renee's fond of using family examples. I mean, it's the same with a spouse. You pretty much have to talk, converse, communicate daily in order to avoid conflict. And so that's sort of why this example can be used, or one like it, appropriate for your geographic area, to kind of lead them into the importance of communicating on and I'll highlight and underscore a regular basis, regular and ongoing basis. They could have avoided this. Frequently, it could be a non-family member that's better suited to take over the business. It could be a grandkid. We find a lot of grandkids are interested, but not kids. Had discussions taken place, the good communication taken place, this likely could have been avoided altogether and a better outcome for the legacy of those senior farm or forest owners. So I will turn it back to Renee.
Thanks, Kurt. Yeah, and you're bringing up that issue of communication. You know, we have a lot of undergrads at Purdue in the Department of Ag Econ, and, you know, they just have it in their head at 20 or 22 that they're going back and they're going to take over that family business, right? They're going to take over that farm. And a lot of times we say, okay, who's running the farm now? Say grandma and grandpa. We're like, okay, are your parents on the farm? Well, yeah. Like, are they managing it yet? And then they think, oh crap, they're not. So I'm probably not either. But yeah, that communication is so important, and having those expectations, knowing what your role is and knowing what your role is going to be is really, really important. But when we think about resolution and succession, it might not always occur. I've done some consultations with some families. You know, there was a junior generation that had bought into the farm. He was working on that farm along with his off-farm job. His brother and his dad were on the farm. He said, okay, I've committed this amount of money. This is my payout schedule that I'm buying into the business. They're not letting me have a say in decisions. They're not open about decisions. What do I do? You know, and we had a conversation kind of away from the family with him and his wife about, you know, what is more important? Do you want to be part of the business or do you want to be part of the family? Can you do both? After meeting with that family a couple of times, it actually came to be that that son said, okay, I'm not going to be part of the farm anymore, but I want to have Christmas with my siblings and I want to still be part of the family. And so that could be a resolution. That doesn't always occur, but we want some kind of resolution where both parties come to some kind of agreement and come to some closure on each experience. I like to use the XYZ framework. So, you can set it up in this way. We have an example. When you don't return my calls after I leave you a message about our contract, I feel my concerns are not important. So I use this at home. I use this at work. It's a really good way to not place blame on other people, but it's saying, when these actions occur, this is how I feel. Okay, you're saying this is how I feel, not you make me feel like this, because that's very confrontational and will surely cause conflict. So using the XYZ model, you can help to start the conversation and work through some of those feelings. But really, when we get to resolution, we want to have an attitude of resolution. We don't want to keep bringing up the conflict. If it's already put to rest, kind of let it lie, and try to move on from that. So when we're thinking about getting to resolution in succession, communication is definitely required. We have to communicate. Whether or not you're an extrovert, it doesn't matter. You have to communicate through the succession process to make sure that everyone is heard. Realization that succession will take time. So if we're talking about intra-family succession of family businesses, it takes about 6.5 years from when you actually start transitioning things to when things are completely transitioned. So succession takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of resources. Sometimes you need outside help, whether that's a family therapist that you need. Maybe you need an attorney. Most likely you do. Maybe you need a CPA, maybe you need a financial advisor. All of these different resources are out there and they can be really vital when you need some help. But ultimately, commitment to the process is necessary from all the parties who are involved to make sure that we get to resolution in succession. And with that, I think that wraps up our module 1. Does anyone have any questions for Kurt or I or Becky or Roseanne?
We had one in the chat, and it was, would one-on-one conversation be beneficial to have with each heir?
Yeah, sometimes it is beneficial to have those one-on-one conversations to kind of explain why this heir is getting this in the process, or, this is going to be your role that we have envisioned for you. And that way you can receive feedback. A lot of times what the incumbent will do is draft a plan and then just not communicate that plan. That's what we don't want to do. Sometimes it's hard if the incumbent is explaining that plan to everybody at one time. Reactions. We can't always hide our reactions. So sometimes it's good to speak one-on-one to each individual about that.
I might add and agree with everything you said, Renee, but also just to admonish the incumbent to be consistent and alike in how they talk to each one. Not to present 4 or 5 different conversations or versions about succession.
That's so true.
Renee, Kurt, would you address for an extension agent that isn't trained in mediation, is just receiving this material? They've got a family with a lot of messiness, right? Help them figure out how to stay in their lane and how to identify when to refer.
Yeah, I think for me, when I do this, I just kind of go with my gut. If something's getting escalated to the point where I don't feel like I know how to handle it anymore, I'm pretty quick to say, I'm this. I don't have expertise in what you're looking for. Let's try to find somebody. Even when we do refer people to family therapists, I know that people laugh at that, but really we have gone into situations where we're helping people and we can see, we're not family therapists. We're here to help everybody have a voice and talk through the succession process. I'm not a licensed therapist. I see a lot of toxic behaviors going on. I don't know how to address that. So we can say, at this point, we think that some family therapy might be helpful. We can help you find somebody and connect with those resources. But yeah, I just really have to go with my gut. If you feel uncomfortable answering a question or you feel like you don't really know, it's okay to say that.
I think I'll just agree with everything you said and add, I think it's perfectly great to seek a third party or outside source. Whether that's an attorney, a trusted family friend, in the African American community in the South, that might be a pastor, whoever it is that's sort of impartial and respected. Perhaps can lend a hand with those kinds of things as well. But yeah, that's a difficult question to kind of give a clean answer to.
We had a couple questions about mediation. So do you ever recommend mediation in this type of situation? And is that, um, like, is this something worth being charged for to find that third party that you hire to play as that mediator?
I'll take a quick run at it and then Renee can follow behind me. Of course, my experience is limited to where I am, right? But we have several mediation centers throughout the state that we're in, and I know for a fact they're throughout the United States. The way our mediation center works is there's two models. You can have an independent mediator that will serve your family. It's free of charge in North Carolina. Well, they'll take you to a certain point, but no farther. But they also have a type of mediation that they recommend, and this is what they like to do, is everybody signs a contract that they'll abide and agree with the mediated decision. And so a lot of people balk at that, but they've been pretty effective at sort of resolving complex, difficult family generations with, multiple marriages, multiple interests, multiple kids, by everybody putting their cards on the table at the beginning and say, we'll abide by our, how this mediator decides it. But so, yeah, I think they have a place. I think they have great value. And I would look in your state to see what kind of services might be available.
Yeah, that's great, Kurt. So in Indiana, well, we have the Purdue succession planning team. And we can come in on not legally binding, but we can come in and we like to have at least 2 educators or specialists at a family meeting to discuss issues and kind of serve as that mediator to make sure everyone's heard. A lot of times we have rules of conduct. If we think that conversations are going to get really heated or something like that, we'll come in and say, we're going to let everybody talk. We're going to not speak over each other. Everybody has X amount of minutes and things like that. But mediation can be invaluable in the succession process.
The questions are really pouring in, and we've just got a few minutes left. Just a couple really good ones. Do you have any tips on long distance communication and or communicating with relationally distant heirs?
Yeah, so sometimes we have families join via Zoom. Actually, we've done that in quite a few scenarios. Sometimes it's helpful, even if some of the farms or families that you're working with are close in geographical location to you. Sometimes it's helpful that everybody jumps on Zoom so you can see everybody equally and everybody can hear each other. We've used Zoom quite a bit for communicating with those relationally distant heirs as well as long distance.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunities for that. Family reunions are a good opportunity to get everybody together, but you have to carve out distinct and separate time from sort of eating and fellowshipping to actually talk business. I know we're a little shy on time, just encourage everybody to hang in there as well. Because we have a lot of materials, workbooks, worksheets, where we'll talk about how to plan a family meeting. We'll talk about some of the what I sense is more detail that people might be interested in, and more tools. So just an encouragement to hang with us for the next 4 modules.
Mm-hmm.
I will send another reminder next week for our presentation where we will be kind of jumping ahead to what is technically Module 3. In Module 3, Kurt, do you want to give us a little snippet of what our topic will be?
I apologize. You caught me off guard there a little bit. But we'll be getting into some of the what I think a lot of people will be interested in. There'll be a little bit of the legal architecture in there. So a little bit more legalese and a little bit more pointing people into different vehicles, legal vehicles or things that they can use during that time. And I think Becky will be picking up a significant part of that as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kurt. That's kind of a little teaser of what next week will be. All of our sessions will be recorded either this afternoon or tomorrow morning. I will be reaching out to you via email We have all of these materials on a website that you can look at the PowerPoint presentation. You'll have access to the handouts. And then once we have the recording back and we've kind of cleaned it up, we'll post this recording under each of the modules as well. So you'll have access to everything that you have seen here and more, because there's some things that we didn't throw into the chat box for you today. So thank you all again for being here. Your questions were amazing. Your participation was amazing as well. If you have any questions in between, feel free to reach out to me or any of the presenters today with any pressing questions that you might have. So everybody try to stay warm, stay safe. If you have some icy, wintry weather that you may not be used to at this time of the year. And we will see everybody same time, same place next week.